Welcome back. This is week 2, lecture 2, Confessionalization in the Nation State. And this lecture kind of sums up what the last couple of lectures, continues the background, so to speak, to the beginning point, which I've already talked about the problematics of that concept. But the beginning of this course, at least according to the textbook, in 1648, after the Peace of Westphalia and the end of the 30 Years' War, looking at the transition from the myth of Christendom and how that became transformed into the myth of the nation state. This is the end of medieval Christendom and the kind of the crumbling of it, and then what comes out of the ashes. That's what we're kind of looking here. And my argument is that it's the crumbling of the myth of Christendom and the emergence of the myth of the nation state, which again, with myth being the overarching ideology of how the world works and what are the structures of authority that we can rely on and assume. In many ways, that's basically another definition of it. Now, historians have referred to confessionalization. It's a thesis that was first introduced in the 1980s by a couple of German historians to describe the events and the phenomena from the later 16th century on into the 17th century in terms of Europe. So it's not so much a focus on the theology, but on the political implementation of those theological debates and what that meant for statehood. We need to go back and look at some of the origins of confessionalization and how it got going to see this transformation. In some ways, we could say this is looking at the outcomes of the Reformation, even though the outcomes are still part of the process, so to speak. And if we look at the issues that I talked about last week, lectures in terms of the Reformation, we can see it as the religio-political dynamics of this transformation. And then when I talked about in the previous lecture, we can see it as the political economic transformations. And I ended last lecture with the blown mind of Europe. Europe's mind was blown because both of these developments forced a reconceptualization of what Europe was. And how do we understand it? How do we understand ourselves in this new world with new structures that we have no previous experience with? Now we look at it all today and we think, well, of course, that's just a natural development, and this beginning the movement towards being like us, so to speak. So it makes perfect sense because the myth of the nation state was the new paradigm, and we will see when we get to further on in this course, towards the end of this course, the problem we face in our world today, and have been for a while, is when our paradigm, our myth of the nation state is falling apart. What is replacing it, what will replace it, we haven't gotten there yet. And that was the situation in which Europeans found themselves in the mid to later 16th century and on into the 17th century before a new kind of understanding began to settle in. Now, again, with these overarching myths or ideologies, I don't mean to say that everybody agreed with everything about them and they all were one nice, big, happy family. That's not what I'm saying at all. But the basic common assumptions of how the world worked. Now, the term paradigm, actually, as I'm using it here, comes from the historian and philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, who used it to talk about the scientific revolution. And we'll be talking more about that when we get there. But essentially what his argument is in terms of a paradigm is that there is an acceptance of a reality that is very slow to change. And the first attempts to point out that the conception of reality is not in accordance with what is observed and experienced are rebuked. And it takes a while before this transition from one paradigm, or I call the myth, or ideology, we can refer to it as that too, to a new one takes a lot of time. It's a slow process, but then Kuhn argues that all of this, there's a point where it's slow, and all of a sudden, boom, there's a point of transition. In terms of the overarching understanding of European society, from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state. Historically, we can't, or I can't, point to that tipping point because there's too many factors involved. So we can't say that, when the start of colonialization was the tipping point, but that was a pretty good, big one, and good one. We can't say, the 30 Years' War was a tipping point, even though that too is a good one. I'll be talking about that shortly. We can't even say that the theological religious Reformation and impact thereof was the tipping point. It was all these together. And so I hope that one of the things you got out of the last couple of lectures is that these were developments going on at the same time. I mean, Columbus set sail in 1492, same year that the Jews were expelled from Spain and the Spanish Inquisition was in place. Roman Inquisition doesn't come later, which I'll talk about a little bit today, I think. So it is this ongoing process. And the New World was, to the Europeans, was just becoming known at the same time that then Luther starts his movement. And it's not so much that Luther started his movement, but a movement developed around Luther's theological critique. And that grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. Now, those are some of the things I talked about in the previous two lectures. Here, we're going to look at the impact of those developments, at least in the religio-political realms, which behind that is the theological arguments, and see how that then played out for the rest of the 16th century and on beyond to the early 17th century. And it's under the concept of confessionalization in the early modern state, in the nation state, that I hope to discuss these developments, which is not the totality of it all, but at least the major contours of the emerging new myth or new ideology of the nation state, replacing the myth of Christendom. That being said, we'll get going to it, and we have first here then some background and definitions of confessional Europe. To begin talking about confessionalization, we have to talk about what confession is, and confessional Europe is. And to do that, we have to begin with the historical origins of the term Protestants. It is, on one level, the term Protestant is used very broadly. It means not Roman Catholic. That's true. But then the question is, when did Luther become a Protestant? When did the Reformation become Protestant? Protesting is not always the same. There have been critiques against the church all along. Luther was not the first to complain about indulgences by any means. I've already mentioned some of the critiques in the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. So that in itself is not, quote unquote, being Protestant. The term, we can't pinpoint the term to a historical development in 1529. Because what happened? Okay. So Luther, as his discoveries, his theses are spread, he starts getting into hot water with the church. He has support from his own prince, Frederick the Wise, and from other German princes. And there's also tension going on at the time between the German princes and the emperor, and between the empire and Rome. Rome, as the Pope, was seen as kind of almost an Italian institution. And there was a general sense that the Italians and the Rome, under the Pope, was just kind of fleecing the Germans. So it's like this sense of, again, this goes back all the way to the papal imperial conflict, going all the way back. So when Luther is threatened with excommunication in 1520, which he wasn't until he wrote his three treatises. He had this big discovery in February of 1520, which I don't think I mentioned, but I would be getting into too many details, but if you're interested, I can certainly elaborate a lot more on. So it wasn't his discovery of passive righteousness. It wasn't his attack against indulgences that set off, quote unquote, the Reformation. It was these two discoveries in 1520, one of which the papacy itself was the throne of Antichrist. There's a lot of development behind that. So he writes these three treatises in 1520, and then he is threatened with excommunication if he doesn't recant. Luther, in December of 1520, burns the bull Exsurge Domine, which is "Arise, O Lord, because of the wild boar in your vineyard," calling for Luther to recant and threatening excommunication. He's not excommunicated until 1521, but the die was already cast. Luther had his discovery. He had appealed to Pope Leo, the Medici Pope, from the great Florentine banking family, the Medici, and the Pope fell on deaf ears because the Pope still read his attacks as, "You are critiquing me and undermining papal authority." Well, Luther was, what are you talking about? I'm a papist. But when he has his discovery that the papacy itself is the throne of Antichrist, that goes out the door, and Luther goes on the attack. And he has support by Frederick, and on we go. In the Bull of Excommunication, and I forget the exact title of it, Exsurge Domine is the bull threatening excommunication. It calls for Luther to be confiscated, sent to Rome to be tried for heresy, and all of his books to be burned, blah, 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 blah. The German princes by this time, not only Frederick the Wise, but Philip of Hesse as well, another German prince, was reluctant because they saw this as Roman incursions. A lot of the resistance to the indulgences was seen as the Romans taxing the Germans to build the new St. Peter's, which is partly what it was. So there's like, no, let's deal with this situation on our own terms, on our own soil. Let's not just ship Luther off to Rome. Charles V was a young Holy Roman Emperor. He was elected in 1519 at the age of 19. And he was persuaded by the German princes to say, okay, well, we'll look at this on our terms. And at the meeting of the imperial legislature, the Reichstag, in Worms, we will deal with this. 1521, summer of 1521. The Diet of Worms, and Luther is brought before the Diet. But again, as the story goes, a lot of background to this as well. But he was asked if he would recant, and Luther said, "No, I can't." And that's his famous apocryphal statement: "Here I stand, I can do no other. God help me, amen." What he actually said is basically, unless I can be convinced on Scripture, it would go against I'd have to go against my conscience if I recanted everything as a whole. Basically, I think I'm not above making mistakes, but I'm not going to, unless I can go through all my works line by line and say, okay, I'll recant that. No, I'll reformulate that, which was the traditional process for such things. But Luther wasn't given that option. He said, no, here are your works. Do you recant them or no? He said, on that basis, if I'm not given that, unless I can be convinced from Scripture, it would be if I were to recant, I would be going against my conscience, which is a sin, and therefore I will not and cannot recant. God help me, amen. The "here I stand" phrase was a later addition to make it more dramatic. But that stance of Luther's at Worms, which often has been portrayed as this modern idea of appeal to conscience and individuality, was not that whatsoever. It was the traditional, medieval, moral, theological position and psychological position that even if you were wrong, to act against your conscience was even worse, because it was like adding another sin. It was a sin to go through, act against your conscience, because your conscience, theoretically, in medieval psychological terms, on commentaries on De Anima, or on the soul, that was what the psychology was at the time, discussions of the soul, what did they consist of. There's a part of your soul called what was referred to as the synteresis, and that was like the spark of right and wrong, the spark of the original creation after the fall, that still told us that is wrong, that is right. There was a little remnant that was not affected by the fall. And that synteresis was our conscience. And to go against that, since that was a divine spark within us, was even worse than any error we might adhere to. That was the medieval view, and that's what Luther did. He said it would be a sin to go against my conscience. Therefore, I will not and cannot recant. God help me. Amen. He expected to be burned. He knew what had happened to Jan Hus at the Council of Constance. And he was resigned to it. He wasn't going to fight that. Charles V, the emperor, said, okay, Martin, basically it was like, how can you alone be right and 1,500 years of Christian tradition be wrong? Which also wasn't based on a misunderstanding, but that's another issue. So therefore you are under condemnation and the ban. You are to be captured and sent to Rome. But I promised you safe conduct, which is something that the Council of Constance had promised Jan Hus of the Council of Constance in 1415. And then when he was condemned as a heretic, they said, well, that a heretic isn't privy to safe conduct, and so they burned him right then and there. But Charles, I have a lot of respect for Charles V. He goes, I'm a man of my word. And so I will, you may leave. And once you leave the Reichstag and Worms, then it's all off. You're to be captured. So Luther leaves Worms expecting to be recaptured and sent to Rome. He was captured. He was captured and whisked away, kidnapped. Bag over his head. He didn't know what was going on. He was kidnapped by his own prince, Frederick the Wise, who whisked him off to his castle in the Wartburg to hide him and protect him. Because Frederick was, I don't think really he got a fair deal here. So there's tensions between then Luther, who's under the ban of the emperor, as well as of the Pope, and Frederick, the Elector of Saxony, a major German prince, protecting and hiding him. Other German princes started to protect him and hide him as well. And it's a long development to make it kind of a little short. And then also politically problematic because Charles V starts a series of wars with Francis I, or Francis I starts a series of wars with Charles. It's called the Habsburg-Valois Wars. And Charles really had not had the ability to focus on the quote-unquote religious problem within the empire. He was also king of Spain already since he was 1516, and he became Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, and this is really the origins of the Habsburg power. And Habsburg Europe would be there throughout most of this course until we get to the latter part of it. It's a family, a dynasty, the Habsburgs. Austria is their kind of base of their family possessions, but then Charles V also inherited the lowlands through his mother and father. It's a long story behind that. And then he would be king of Spain, so he's king of Spain. Netherlands, all of the territory of the empire, including then his family holdings in Austria. He controlled more territory than had anybody since Charlemagne. That is a big, big deal. The Pope was wary. That's why the Pope was supporting Francis I against Charles. Now, he was busy off dealing with other political fires, so to speak, which allowed Luther and his message to spread. This is the age of printing, when printing is developing and spreading like wildfire. So all of a sudden, the transmission of information is just exponentially growing. And Luther dominated the press, dominated the media. Over, I think, 65 or 70% of the media, what was being published was works about Luther, or about Luther, supporting Luther. Now, the point of all this, it's a political problem all of a sudden, because if you're protecting Luther, if you are not handing him over, you are in rebellion against the emperor and against imperial law and the legislature, the Reichstag. Frederick knew this. Other German princes knew this. They said, we have to handle this within the imperial legislature, the Reichstag. They tried to do so in 1526. I'm skipping a lot, obviously. The Diet of Speyer. The Diet just means the meeting of the Reichstag. The Diet of Speyer in 1526. Charles V was not there. What do we do? How do we go about it? Didn't really go anywhere. It was kind of put off until later. The next Diet of Speyer, also in 1529. They said, okay, we have this Edict of Worms. The Edict of Worms was the document that Charles V signed that was passed by the imperial legislature, the Reichstag, in 1521 after the Diet of Worms, condemning Luther. And it was whether or not this edict, this imperial edict, should be enforced. In 1529, we have then these princes who referred to themselves as evangelicals. That's what they were called, evangelicals, not in the modern sense of that term in any way, shape, or form. You can think of them as Lutherans. Lutheran at first was an outgroup term. It was a term of derision for people who follow Luther, the Lutherani, as a way of undermining and delegitimizing the movement. But the self design term or label that they used was the evangelicals. Now, which is basically the gospel, the basis of the gospel, pure preaching of the gospel. They presented their case at the Diet of Speyer in 1529, and the Diet said, no, the Edict of Worms must be enforced. And these princes, these evangelical princes in a few imperial cities, said, no, we protest. And they left the Diet of Speyer. They were, from that point on, known as the protesting princes and cities, or the Protestants. That's the origin of the term Protestant. And then we have these Protestants realizing, oh my God, we are now in open kind of rebellion against the emperor. We have one last shot. That is at the Diet of Augsburg to meet next year in 1530. We have to get our act together. So what we're going to do, we're going to be precise. We're going to be clear. We're going to present a document that is going to detail and outline our position theologically, religiously, and how that works out politically. This is a document that will be presented that will confess what we believe and what we hold to. It's called the Confession of Augsburg. It's a document that you will read if you haven't already, because it's been assigned for this week. That's the Confession of Augsburg. And a confession, as I think I mentioned last lecture or so, the one before, is not of, oh, I'm sorry. It is, here I stand. This really was the here I stand document. And at the Diet of Augsburg in 1530, which Luther could not attend because he was under imperial ban, but his right-hand man, Philip Melanchthon, presented it with others. And so there's all kinds of stories behind this development as well. But the issue is that this is a document. And the Protestant princes said, this is the basis of what we stand for. And the Diet of Augsburg said, no. The Edict of Worms still must be enforced. These were already Protestant princes, and they weren't going to go along with it then at this point. And they left Augsburg knowing that civil war was coming. And they formed what became called the League of Schmalkalden in 1531 after the Confession of Augsburg. And the League of Schmalkalden, led by Philip of Hesse, and by this time Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, had died, but it was his son John Friedrich. So we need to be ready for civil war, for war against the emperor. Now, the period from 1531 to the early to mid 1540s was a period, let's say, call it the Cold War phase, between the League of Schmalkalden, or the Lutheran evangelical princes and territories, and the Catholic territories. There was formed what's called the Catholic League as well, in opposition to the Protestant League of Schmalkalden. There was outbreaks of battles, then beginning in the mid-1540s. Stalemate on both sides. Sometimes the Protestants would win, sometimes the emperor would win. The emperor won a fairly decisive battle. And then imposed what was called the Imperial Interim in 1548, saying, okay, we need to really deal with this. You may have some legitimacy. We can negotiate some aspects. But we still have to go back to more or less the Catholic way of doing things. And that no one really liked the interim. And it appeared by the early 1550s that there was not going to be a military solution. 1555, the Diet of Augsburg. 1555, as opposed to the Diet of Augsburg in 1530 with the Confession of Augsburg, got together and said, okay, what are we going to do? Now, the Confession of Augsburg also was important because from 1530 on, after it was created and presented, the spread of the movement, the spread of Lutheranism or of evangelical movement, the spread of the Protestants was based on the acceptance of the Confession of Augsburg. So if a territory or principality thought, they have some good ideas, I think we'll join up, they had to agree to and to accept the Confession of Augsburg as the basis of their religious territory. Sometimes it was kind of more or less imposed by force. The case of Hildesheim is a great one, because Hildesheim, they resisted, and politically and militarily they had no option but to join with the League of Schmalkalden, because the League of Schmalkalden just kind of squeezed them and forced them politically, and so the city council of Hildesheim accepted then the Confession of Augsburg. There was a lot of talk among the League of Schmalkalden and among the advisors of Henry VIII of England to maybe join up with the League of Schmalkalden. But the League of Schmalkalden said, no, you have to then accept the Confession of Augsburg. And Henry's like, no way in hell am I going to do that. So that never happened. Even, one of his advisors got into a lot of trouble and lost his head because supposedly he was selling out the English to the Lutherans. So this is a political, religious, theological event all in one. And in 1555, Peace of Augsburg came to a solution, which really wasn't all that satisfactory. And I believe, though, that is something that I will be talking about in the next slide in terms of the outcomes of the Reformation. So that's setting up the Diet of Augsburg in 1555. But that's really what the Confession of Augsburg was about. It was the first time that there was a document, a confession that became the basis of territorial power and authority. Big deal. And that is part of the beginnings of the process that we refer to as confessionalization. Now, on the slide up there, I have a definition of confessionalization as the process or processes by which a particular religious confession was inculcated within a given political state as a means of territorial state building, end quote. Not every confessional document was a confession. There was a number of confessions that emerged. Confession of Heidelberg later was developed already back at the Diet of Worms in 1530. Some of the lower German cities and Swiss cities presented what was called the Confessio Tetrapolitana, or the Four Cities Confessions. But there are other types of confessional documents too that become normative and authoritative of the religio-political doctrine of a given territory. That was the basis of the process of confessionalization, whereby individual territories and states, political entities, independent political entities, were based on a religious confession. It was not just a religious confession, it was theological, it was political. And that became the basis for understanding what was going on in Europe from mid-16th century on into at least into the mid-17th century or beyond. So when we go and look at the landscape as a result or outcome of the Reformation, what do we find? I'm going to just sketch it here, and then I'll go into some of the more details in terms of the more particular outcomes in the next slide. We have, in terms of confessionalization, we have Catholic Europe, which is consisted of Italy, Spain, parts of the Empire, most of France, Ireland, and Belgium. Now, France is a kingdom. The Empire, as I try to say, was a confederation of states. The emperor was elected, as was the Pope, but it consisted of independent principalities, kingdoms, dukes, the Elector of Saxony, the Duke of Saxony. It's kind of a complicated political development, what was going on there. The Margrave of Brandenburg, there are 7 electors, the King of Bohemia, were all part of the empire underneath the emperor as a confederation. Whereas France is still the King of France, the Kingdom of France. Ireland is still kind of what? It's not really a kingdom of Ireland. Ireland is more problematic, but it became Catholic and was staunchly Catholic. Belgium, it was in the southern Netherlands. That was Catholic, and I'll get to how that came about later. So there are certainly large areas that are Catholic, and here we can start referring to it as Roman Catholic, because Catholic, which just means universal. Before, let's say 1530 in any case, the term Catholic simply meant universal. It was identical with Christianity, at least in the West. Thereafter, when we start having these confessional breakups and splits and divisions, Catholic meant following Rome. And so we can really talk about Roman Catholicism. We can only talk about Roman Catholicism before 1530 only if we're contrasting that with the Greek Byzantine Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church. Otherwise, it's just Catholic. Now, Lutheran, those territories were parts of the empire, certainly, obviously. Not the entire empire, but parts of the empire. And then a fair amount of Scandinavia became Lutheran. But then, as I mentioned, not in the previous lecture, but the one before, we have Calvinism. And Calvinism was referred to as the Reformed confessions or Reformed faith. And I'll talk more about those confessional documents in a minute. And obviously, Geneva and some of the Swiss cities were Reformed, were Calvinist. Some of these were parts of the empire. So we have then within the empire Catholic territories, Lutheran territories, and then Calvinist territories, even though the emperor and the Reichstag did not recognize the Calvinist territories. We'll come back later to talk about that. Some parts of France, as we'll see shortly as well, became pockets of Reformed belief. I have it there, the Treaty of Nantes in 1598. We'll get to that in the next slide. But Calvinism also had spread to England and to Scotland and into the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic. So there are these pockets of Calvinism or the Reformed tradition within Europe. Russia, which is part of kind of at this time, is it part of Europe? Yes, sort of. It was very much aware part of all this was Greek Orthodox. But then there were those groups without a political base. The Jews, there was no Jewish state within Europe. And then basically the Radical Reformation, which consisted both of Baptists and Unitarians. As I talked about it before in the previous lectures, not the last one, but the one before, they had no political base. And that was in some ways part of the reason they didn't have more of an impact, because there was no political base for the Baptists or the Unitarians or various other groups grouped together as a Radical Reformation. So all of a sudden, we have a wide diversity of beliefs, political territories, confessions within Europe, whereas 100 years before, even 50 years before, there was only one. This really is the beginning and the outcome of the confessionalization process, which was a result of the Reformation and what was unleashed by Luther. And I would argue, and as I have very clearly, that Luther did not become the reformer until at least 1520 with his great discoveries. I think it's to a lot of historiographical debate. And the Reformation certainly did not begin with his posting of the 95 Theses in terms of Luther's own development and in terms of what had come before, because the posting of the 95 Theses is like Luther was not the first to critique indulgences at all. There's a lot of support for it. It's just part of that late medieval Reformation. The Reformation of the later Middle Ages is going on until at least 1520. Now, within the Catholic side, it just kind of continues. somewhat transformed. But then we have beginning of Luther's all-out attack against Rome and the break from Rome, which then throws open the doors and all hell breaks loose in some ways. And I don't mean that in a qualitative sense or a theological sense. I'm meaning just in the colloquial sense of everything breaks apart. And then what? How do we deal with this? How do we deal with this new reality? What would happen if the United States broke up? If all of a sudden, not just Texas, but let's say a number of states didn't go to war necessarily, but simply proclaimed their independence from the United States. What do we do? What do we do? If there would be war, as there was in Europe, which I'll be talking about shortly. And if there was stalemates, then it's like, okay, well, how do we then reconceive of what it is that this territory is, and whereas we all had thought of ourselves as Americans, as amorphous as that term is and always had been, we can't really think of ourselves that way anymore if the United States broke up. So how do we think of ourselves? What does it mean? How do we go about it? That was the dilemma facing Europeans from the mid-16th century on. So it's a new world indeed, and it's talking about being blown the minds of. That was like, yeah, what do you do? Oh my God, what we always had assumed would be the case is no longer the case. So now what? That's what they were facing. But let's go back a little bit, because that's kind of the outcome of confessional Europe. The new reality within Europe and the ongoing confessionalization process as it continues to expand, as different territories are also seeking conversion, and including then the New World. Because that missionary zeal within the New World is leading to colonialization, which I talked about last lecture, which is part of the same process. Colonialization and confessionalization go hand in hand, even if in the New World, in the terms of colonialism, the confessions they brought with them to impose, so to speak. So there's a different little phenomena in the colonial system than there is within, let's say, the core, using Emanuel Wallerstein's terms of the world system, and the core countries within Europe in terms of confessionalization. But it goes hand in hand, all one together. So let's look at then the outcomes of the Reformation. Here, meaning the original kind of opening up of the lid. I have it there, the Empire and the Peace of Augsburg. There's outcomes of the Reformation. So first, it's outcome of the Reformation in the Empire. I said of the war, talked about the Schmalkaldic Wars, the League of Schmalkalden against the imperial forces of the Catholic League, back and forth, and then we get to the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, and Charles V realized this isn't going to work. Now, I've referred to Charles as the last medieval emperor, because he believed in this ideology of Christendom. The view, the myth that there is, one government led by the emperor based on God's appointed choice, together with the Pope, to lead Christianity or lead Christendom, not only within Europe, but throughout the world. It's a nice vision. And we could critique it on all kinds of bases. But that was what Charles had in mind. And he came to see the reality that this was not going to work. The solution that was agreed to in the Augsburg, Deed of Augsburg in 1555 is called the Peace of Augsburg, that set peace within the empire. Now, the solution was this. The religion of the prince will be the religion of the territory. Namely, Lutheran or evangelical princes could remain Lutheran or evangelical, and their entire territory would be that way. Catholic princes could remain Catholic, and their entire territory would be Catholic. It was a choice of the prince, or duke, or count, or whatever, within these major principalities. And if you're just a common person, if you were, a Lutheran, but you're in a Catholic territory, after 1555, you had to move or convert, and vice versa. The religion of the prince is a religion of the territory. Cuius regio, eius religio, as it was later formulated. Who's the reign, his the rule. No, who's the rule, his the religion. There were then two legal religious confessions within the empire. The Confession of Augsburg and adherence to Rome. That was not the medieval idea. And Charles V abdicated, retired to a monastery. He had his son, Philip II, as King of Spain, whereas his brother, Ferdinand, became emperor and head of the Habsburg family holdings in Austria. But this whole process greatly undermined the power and authority of the emperor. And Spain was a Catholic territory and was rising. Very important. We entered kind of the golden age of Spain, which is part of the developments, because by 1555, Spain is already reaping great wealth from the colonies. We'll see that as we go along. That is what happened in the empire. I see I got to get going here if I'm going to get through all of this. Early modern Roman Catholicism and the Council of Trent. I've already addressed the issue of Roman Catholicism. The Catholics were somewhat slow to respond, just as within the empires, like we had to come up with a council for this, or the Diet, deal with this in the Diet. For the traditional Catholicism, for the traditional papal church, we have to deal with this in the council, even though we don't want to. That's a long history there. But finally, a council was called the Council of Trent in 1545, which met on and off until 1563. So as the Peace of Augsburg is being formulated right in the midst of the various sessions of the Council of Trent, which was designed to set the Catholic house in order and to act as a confessional document for Catholicism, for Roman Catholicism. The decrees of Trent were used in the same way as the Confession of Augsburg. And in the very first session, the Council of Trent started with the doctrine of the decree on justification. And their statement and assertion is almost word for word what Luther said about it. There are differences, certainly. That would go into the theological issues more than I really have time to do so here, even though I would love to do so. But it's like it almost tacitly acknowledges that Luther was right about a lot of things theologically, that there was corruption and everything else. And this was in the whole attempt, the Council of Trent, to say, and this is what we believe. And the Council of Trent set Catholic doctrine from 1563 as a confessional document until 1963 in the opening of Vatican II. Major development and a major impact on the West and the world. Now, French Wars of Religion, the Edict of Nantes. I talked about France before with Calvin. Calvin having fled and gone to Geneva, but always looking towards France. Fantastic developments that I'm going to have to briefly go over. But Calvin had established kind of this underground railroad going back from Geneva, going back into France, smuggling literature, smuggling books and French translations of the Bible, and so back into France. Refugees were fleeing to Geneva. And Calvin's whole point was to convert France. And I think I already mentioned that from the first edition of his Institutes of the Christian Religion in 1536 until the final edition in 1559, every edition included the same letter to Francis I. Now, in my Reformation class, in my 113 class, because again, this is that period of overlap, I assign Calvin's letter to Francis. But he's appealing to the King of France to say, this is what we believe. And his institutes, along with that letter, became the basis of Calvinistic or Reformed confessional documents, together with his ecclesiastical ordinances for Geneva, which were established and accepted by the city council, as the basis of Reformation in Geneva. And it was only then later that the Heidelberg Confession was established, in the Heidelberg Catechism, as explicitly labeled and named confession. But they're confessional documents like the Creeds of the Council of Trent. There's not the term confession there, but they were confessional documents as the basis of Reformation. That's what it was with the Reformed tradition. And there were pockets in France that were being converted, including what's been called the Princes of the Blood. Now, why is that important? There had been a long-standing debate, at least theoretically, within Europe, medieval Christendom. Is there a right to rebel against a tyrant? There it goes back and forth. Some people said, yes, you can. Others said, no, you cannot, under any circumstances. It's also the question is who gets to determine what is being a tyrant. And so it was a debate in political theory more than in actual practice, even though there's always tensions that bring about these theoretical debates. One solution, which was the accepted one in France at this time, was that there can be a rebellion against the established monarch, the God-appointed monarch, if that monarch is then a heretic or is a tyrant, not fulfilling the office of the monarch. There can be a revolt, but it must be led by princes of the blood. It can't be just the common people rising up. It has to be led by the princes of the blood, the nobility who are partly in line to the throne. They can rise up against the monarch. The common people cannot. So the fact that there were then princes of the blood who had been converted to Calvinism was very significant, because all of a sudden it's like, if you're a Calvinist and the king is Catholic, isn't that by definition being a tyrant? That was the issue in the question. It's very complex what to do about the religious situation in France. Persecution had started with Francis I after the affair of the placards in 1534. What do we do about all of this? To make, again, a very complex, fantastic, fun development, very short and quick, there were a series of wars that broke out beginning in 1562 in France, lasting until 1598, commonly referred to as the French Wars of Religion. But these French Wars of Religion were civil war within France, very similarly or analogous to the civil war that had been going on in Germany from 1531 until 1555. Back and forth, attempts to come to some kind of a solution. There was the hardline Catholic Party that said absolutely no toleration of the French Calvinists, who were known as the Huguenots. Huguenot or the Huguenots. It was debated with the origins of that term, but they were known as the Huguenots. So we have the Huguenots and then the Catholics. Again, going back, skipping over it quite a lot in the various phases of the wars of religion. They were at times granted, the Huguenots were granted territories or areas where they could openly practice and would not be persecuted or sought after. In the southwest of France, La Rochelle is, or the northwest France, sorry, was an area where they really held sway. And one of the princes of the blood was named by the name of Henry of Navarre. He was King of Navarre, which is kind of on the border between France and Spain. And through a series of, let's say, unforeseen or even perhaps unimaginable circumstances and outcomes, Henry of Navarre ends up becoming heir to the throne of France. Henry of Navarre was a Protestant. Now, going back to 1572, after already there had been at least one war of religion, maybe I think even two, the French crown at this point, under Charles IX, who was very young. So it's his mother, Catherine de' Medici, who had been the wife of Henry II, who had been, ruled after Francis I died. Um, Thought, we are aware of this. How do we deal with these Protestants? And Catherine, another very formidable ruler, female ruler, but one who ended up, her policies not being very successful after all, but that was not to no fault of her own in any way, shape, or form. So, okay, if we can kind of appease the Huguenots, how about we arrange a marriage between Henry of Navarre, at this time, before he was heir to the throne, and one of my daughters, Marguerite. Henry agreed. And so there's going to be this royal wedding in August of 1572. Charles IX, young boy, was persuaded by the hardcore Catholic faction under the Duke of Guise to say, this is an opportunity. We'll have targeted executions. Now, obviously, we can't execute Henry of Navarre because he's the groom. But we will execute, target, assassin the Huguenot leaders. That will help dissipate the movement. And Charles IX went along with it, partly maybe because of belief, but partly also because, like, mommy is telling me what to do, and I'm going to show her. It's a complex political situation. But this targeted situation turned out to evolve into an all-out massacre. It's called the Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572, where the leading Huguenots were killed. And it was bloody, it was massy, it was horrible. And this happened in Paris, and it started spilling out throughout France. Henry of Navarre, after the wedding, was held in house arrest and was forced to convert. And he said, okay, I'll convert. But after kind of the melee died down a bit, he escaped, went back to Navarre, and said, oh, I didn't really mean it. I'm converting back to being Calvinist once again. And by this time, he was heir to the throne. The last son of Catherine and Henry II, way back when Henry died early through a fun accident, which was also unforeseen. But that we'll get into too much detail here and now. A bizarre death in a jousting accident. He died in King's jousting, and a splinter of the lance broke off and went right through his. He was, of course, in full armor, but went through his eyepiece and right through his eye and through his brain. He was a relatively young man, but was killed in that way. But he had like 3 sons, and they all fell by the wayside, weakly, sickly. And Charles IX died, and then the last one was Henry III. So this was the Valois. This is still the Valois dynasty in France. But going back a ways, Henry of Navarre was part of, again, the Princes of the Blood, but a different branch called the Bourbon. The Bourbon, or the Bourbon family, Anthony of Bourbon, was part of the leadership and one of the people who was assassinated and killed St. Bartholomew's Day. They were cousins. So Henry IV, leader of the Huguenots now, is cousins with Henry III of Valois. And there's Henry, Duke of Guise. There's a war between the 3 Henrys. It's called the War of the 3 Henrys. And the thing here, Henry III, that was the last surviving Valois. So they needed an heir. Problem was, Henry III was, I think it's safe to say, was gay. He was seen as being an effeminate. He liked poodles more than anything else. That's kind of an overblowing of things, but it became very clear he was not going to produce an heir. And also a very complex situation, he ends up naming Henry IV, or Henry of Navarre, who became Henry IV, but I'm not there yet, his cousin Henry of Navarre as his heir, but that's after fighting the 3 Henrys. So when he dies, when Henry III dies in 1589, the heir to the throne is Henry of Navarre, who was Protestant, who was Calvinist, who was the leader of the Huguenots in opposition to the monarchy. Does he then convert to become the most Christian king? Can France have a Protestant king? the political theory, all of a sudden arguments went back and forth. It was a fantastic switch based on what position you're on. And then there was a position that became known as the politiques, that simply the political expedient solution should be primary, not the religious one. It wasn't a major factor, but that position became increasingly accepted to get beyond all of the killing and the wars over religious beliefs. Henry of Navarre fought his way in opposition to the Catholics, because the Catholic leaders were going to say, no way in hell are we going to have a Protestant king of France. Henry defeats them all. He was a great general. He's a real man in the French eyes, and Henry became Henry IV. And Henry IV is kind of a folk hero in France still, because he was the person who kind of saved France. A real man's man as opposed to Henry III. And he then enters Paris after conquering it, rode his horse. He conquered all his enemies and then said, now that I am king with no opposition that makes it any difference because I'm in control, I will convert as a gift to the country. So he then converts again to become Catholic. A lot has been made of this. There's a saying supposedly they said Paris is worth the mass. But other scholarship has shown that he did this of his own accord, and what he wanted to do is do it on his own terms. He'd been forced to convert in 1572. This time, if he was to convert to be the king of the people, he was going to do it on his own terms, and that he did. And he first consolidated power and rule and authority as Henry IV, King of France, and then he converts to still be the most Christian king. And in 1598, he issues the Edict of Nantes, which grants toleration to the Protestants, the French Protestants, the Huguenots, in various territories there in the Northwest, to worship freely, not a problem, but just not in Paris. Still, Paris was sacrosanct, so to speak. We don't want any Protestantism in Paris, almost going back to the concept of Francis I with the affair of the placards. I don't care what goes on out there, but you don't stick a placard on my bedroom door. For Henry IV, it's like, okay, my people, my Huguenots, you can practice your religion, you can openly do so, you can preach, you can try to convert people, but not in Paris. Okay. That settled the religious wars in France.